Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on page 1354. Aleph Shinun Dalet. I've essentially established that there are 4 types of light in general. Going from the top down, the Ir HaShemesh is the ultimate example of a Ir HaMashpia. It's both bright, Behirus, Ir Bahir, and also is a luminary, a source of light. Ir HaMeir, as he called it. It illuminates, is the primary source of light in existence, in our existence. Ir HaNeir is similar in the same sense. It's far smaller, but also bright and gives off light. And he brought these two together. Then comes 3 levels in Ir Makabel. A glowing stone, or a bright gem even. I'll discuss a little more in detail. I did a little more research on this. The moon and Ir Hariyah. Vision, sight. These are all elements that have a connection to light, but they are all recipients. None of them shine and are a source of light in darkness like the sun. Starting from the moon. The moon is a moir, but it's Ir HaMakabel. It doesn't shine on its own. It needs to be motivated. It needs to be activated. It needs a catalyst. And even then, it's still the sun that's shining through it. Even according to what he's explaining it here, that the moon itself has light, but its fundamental nature is, like he said, is Helam. Whereas the fundamental nature of the sun is Gili. They're both Ma'oris because there's the Koyach HaGili and the Koyach Helam. They're both sources of light. But light doesn't always mean bright light. Light could also be divine energy, which can be the power of concealment or the power of receiving. Evan Toiv, a glowing stone or a shining gem. So there's brightness, and in some cases even shines in the dark. But yet, it never becomes a source of light. As he says, it's actually receiving the light from the sun or from the stars, and it retains it. It becomes part of its personality. It's not just like a mirror. So it's a form of light, but it's Ir HaMakabel in that way. And then there's the third category, the third level, which we call Ir Hariyah, which is Ir HaMakabel, as we explained in the last class at length. He went back and forth to understand. Because on one hand, the eye can see. That means light shines through it and it's able to see things clearly, which is a form of light. However, it's not that the eyes themselves are like illuminators, because in the dark, they can't see. In other words, they need to have sunlight or other form of light. They need siyu, as he put it, the support of something else to allow them to see. On the other hand, it's not the other thing that's making them see, is the eye itself. The primary force that causes the eye to see well is the healthy eye. So essentially, it's a combination of 2 things. That the eye itself sees, but it needs the support and help of an environment that's illuminated. And when you have those 2, then you have the proper eyesight, as he explained it on page 13, on the bottom of 1353 and 1354. We'll soon see how this compares to the other 2 types of Ir HaMakabel. This is going to be a central theme now. These 3 types of light, of Makabel, and of course all the Shemesh is a Mashpia, is going to be continuing on now. Just to give you a lay of the land, I did look ahead just to see where he gets back to it. He comes back to, remember, all this began to explain, he said, to explain Ner Mitzvah and Ner Neshama. This was on page 1352. He says, Nidali Levaida Inyan Apimashakosabi in Eiraria. So this whole right idea is going to go now, tell you exactly till where. Quite a while, actually, much more than I first thought. He comes back to Ner Mitzvah. I'm going to explain these three types of light, and I'll elaborate a bit more in a moment. I just want to see where it goes to. Yeah. To page 1454, literally 100 pages from now, he comes back to Riyah. But even more than that, the Ner Mitzvah B'Torah Eir that this whole thing began with is even later than that. Let me see where. Yeah, page 1463. On 1463, we're talking now 110 pages from now, approximately, exactly 110 pages. He comes back to Ner Mitzvah Torah. So the next 100 pages and so are all going to be an elaboration of these forms of light, and then is going to bring it back to how we understand it in Ner Mitzvah and in Ner Neshama. So that's quite a while. And the whole Hemshech, concludes at 1479, just to give you that sense. Okay. Now, let me elaborate a bit more, a few things here. First of all, regarding these three types of Eir, remember that the central theme of Ayin Beis from the beginning is interface. The interface between God and existence, between the transcendent and the immanent. In different terms, you could say the interface between light and dark. Because if you say light as being clarity and truth, Eir Havaya L'Olam, the light of the divine, which is the truth of existence, and we live in a world, like he explained earlier, that's shrouded in darkness. Olam, Eloshin Helen Behester. Olam comes from the word concealment. And all of existence is predicated on a tzimtzum that conceals the divine, or else we would not have an independent consciousness. So we're dealing with this seemingly insurmountable schism, or chasm is the word I was looking for. So how do you bridge that? That's the story of Ayin Beis. That's the story of Chassidus in general, the story of Torah. How to bring the clarity and the truth of godliness in a world that feels its own truth, which is material existence, dominates. Or in the words that sometimes we use from Ayin Beis, a world where Elamus is b'pshitus, existence is a given, and Elikus b'schashus, and the divine is a novelty. To come back to the truth that Elikus is b'pshitus, that the divine is reality, is a given reality, and Elam is b'schashus, and the world existence is the novelty. So that's a really pretty big dissonance to bridge. But that's the story of the interface, because God created the world not airtight. We have the capacity to retrace the steps and reconnect, basically to illuminate the darkness of existence. Not just to illuminate it, but as we learn, to transform it. And not just transform it with the light of the divine, but transform it from within, because the divine also has the concealment itself is rooted in the Helam Ha'atzmi of the divine. So it's all covered. Everything, we have all the tools needed to join the two together that were once one. Lifnei Tzimtzum is a state of seamless consciousness where there's only divine consciousness and nothing else. La'acharat Tzimtzum, after the Tzimtzum, and remember, after and before is only conceptual. They both are states that exist right now, two different paradigms. Post-Tzimtzum is a reality where there's an independent consciousness, and the goal is to bring them together. That post-Tzimtzum, in existence like ours, where we see ourselves as independent consciousness, come connected to the divine consciousness, and they join again. But it's not just joining again. This time, it's far deeper because it came after the concealment. And to do so properly, you need to have all the different levels of light, because as we see, the maturity process, mutfa, murgish, muskal, all the steps that we've discussed require a process. There's no way to jump the gun. You have to go step by step. as a person who lives in this material world slowly acclimates themselves and gets refined enough to be able to receive higher levels of revelation. As it is with a student and a teacher, the classic example. You can't suddenly understand all the brilliance of the teacher without going step by step. We grow, our minds grow, they expand, and initially everything comes in a very concealed and a very limited flow. And then as the kelim expand, they're capable of receiving and absorbing more light, all the way to the highest levels of light. As we shall learn, Riyah, vision, is a way of saying it when we say, do you see the truth? Not just do you understand it, or did you hear about it? Ultimate Riyah is going to be the ultimate experience. What do you see with your eyes? So we see the material world. But Chassidus and Torah comes to teach us to see another reality, the godly reality. So in the beginning, it's Ayin HaSeichel. It's the eye of the mind. We only see it through our intelligence. Chacham Einav Bereshe, a wise man's eyes are in his head, is through, but ultimately we will be able to v'nigla kved Hashem v'ro kol basar yachdav. He claims in chapter 36 in Tanya, Ayin Be'ayin Yiro, we will see God eye to eye. V'lo yikana feid merecha, we learned. V'ho yiroyis einecha reyes as merecha. There will no longer be a garment that filters or shields the divine revelation. You will see with your anecha reyes as merecha. So seeing is considered the experience, the ultimate experience. That's why by Matan Torah we say we saw. We didn't just hear, we saw the divine. And seeing, of course, is the deepest level of perception of reality. When you see something, seeing is believing, as they say. So sight is going to play an important role in this whole process. Now, if you recall, earlier in the volume 3, he also spoke about sight. Remember the gazing of Abba ve'ima, the father and mother, Chachma and Bina, as they gaze at the forehead of Arich and Atik, and that's ultimate union. Zivuk Shalom, Yichud Abba ve'ima Pnimim, where everything is like when you gaze at something beautiful, you get completely consumed with it. He called that one of the highest levels where they received the 300 and Shin Ayin, the 370 energies, Nahedin. In addition, back in volume 1, when he spoke about the spheres, and he spoke about them in 3 stages or 3 levels, he said sphera comes from 3 words. The first level is sphera from the word mispar, you count, which really signifies more its quantity. Its outer dimension that you see the spheres, the number, which also has value and quality, but primarily the focus is on the quantity. Or as I would say quantity, meaning not the quantity per se, but the external expression of it. Then you have the second level, is sphera from the word sipur. Sipur, what's the difference in a number and a story? A narrative starts revealing there's a story behind it. It's not just a numbers thing. It's not just that it signifies a multitude. There's a story. And then the third level is Even Sapir. What's Even Sapir? A sapphire stone that illuminates, like a transparent stone, reflecting that the spheres are reflections, transparent reflections of godliness. So you see in the spheres too, the stages, because in order for existence to exist, you can't have that bright illumination at the beginning. It has to be concealed. But the goal is to retrace our steps and slowly open our eyes. In the Rebbe's words, the Mashiach Geula is here. All you have to do is open your eyes. It's not just an expression, it's actually the concept of coming to appreciate something in the fullest sense of the word is when you see it with your own eyes. So first they're seeing it with seichel, then they're seeing it with our own eyes. So that's just just to connect a bit why Riyah plays such an important role. But we'll learn a lot more about this as we go along. But the other forms of light, which we'll learn are lower forms, the light of a bright stone or gem, and then the light of the moon, these are also other forms of illumination that are makabel, which means it's on our terms, but it's ultimately an It is receiving from the mashpia. It's just a difference of how they receive, and we'll learn the difference between them. Ultimately, it's going to come down to how much of it is it internalized, and how much is it coming from the mashpia. And the truth is we want both, because remember the goal is to have aramim chelekai hamelach malmayla lamata and malmata lamayla. You want the interface to be both from the top down. Well, let's start from the bottom up, which is tefillah, which we learned at length, from the bottom up, refining ourselves from the bottom up as we daven, and from Elokai HaMelech, from the divine within existence in a concealed state, Elokim, we come to Havaya. Havaya hu Elokim, v'yadaita yem v'shavesa levavecha. And Hayem is yem and Laila, day and night, darkness and light. That Havaya hu Elokim, that even in the concealed Elokim, you recognize that it's coming from Havaya, and even deeper, Ein Oit, where the very Elokim, like we learned, is that the darkness itself, the concealment itself, reveals the Helam Ha'atzmi. And then there's Mamayla Lamata Arimim Chalakei HaMelech from through Torah, which is Torah Oyer. Oyer is shining from the top down. And as we shall learn and understand, in between you have Ner Mitzvah and Ner Neshama. It's not quite like Oyer of Torah, like Shema from the Ayin to the Yesh, but rather it's going from the Yesh to the Ayin. But Ner Mitzvah, like when Ner Neshama, that the Neshama manifests inside the body and the animal soul, and it elevates and causes a flame. So the wick that draws the fuel from the shemen, from the oil, that creates the flame, the divine light. The same thing with a mitzvah, that the mitzvah comes into Gashmisdika things, and like a wick, it draws the divine will through the Gashmisdika thing and creates a fire, a divine fire. And then Torah Oyer is a far higher level of Oyer. And to understand Ner Mitzvah, we're learning now about these three types of light, starting with Oyer Hariyah is the primary one he begins with, to see, the light, the sight and vision, but also in the process, understanding the two other levels, which is the bright stone and the moon. So just not to confuse matters. The moon actually plays two roles in this whole big narrative. One is the moon is like a Ur Makabel, and it's like darkness that ultimately will become greater than the sun. Like we said, that the Makabel, Malchus, will elevate and actually be mashpia to the sun, even to Zah, because it goes to the Helam Ha'atzmi. But there's another part of the moon, the light within the moon. And there the moonlight is lower than the sunlight. It's first of all weaker, and it's a recipient. And that's important to mention. So even though he does speak and mention that the moon is primarily a koyach ha'helam, and I established that that's definitely what he means, what we learned on page 1351. I'm sorry, what, 1352? Yeah. But we're talking about the moon also as a shining element. Remember, we said the Rishima also has light within it. The moon also has light. That light is fundamentally a light of a recipient. However, it's a light within the moon. That's why it's one of the Ma'oris called Moyer Akotin, or Shnei Ma'oris Agdelim. But it's a Moyer that needs the sun to get it going. And when it does, the moon shines because it has a light, but it's ultimately a Eir Makabel, not a Eir Mashpia. Okay. So I want to add a few things, two things, and then maybe if anybody wants to ask anything, we'll continue on where we're up to. I'll bring it back to where we're up. First of all, about the gems, about the stones. So looking into it a bit more, I looked up the sources. There's a few things here. First of all, there is a thing called glowing stones. We discussed that. In Zohar Pasha Truma, Daf Kuf Ayin Beis, Kuf Ayin Aleph Amud Beis, and Kuf Ayin Beis Amud Aleph, that's 171b. And the next page, he talks there about the Mishkan, about the Necheshes, about copper, the things that were made from copper. But he talks there that some stones that exist on Earth have a brightness that comes from the stars. He talks there about how stars impact existence. Like it says, every star makes every blade of grass grow, but he also talks about the stones. In addition, he talks there about gold, that the gold and other objects, and this is also some other places, do have a glow to them. They're stones that are completely dark, meaning they have nothing, they're neutral. But when you look at certain precious gems, they do have a shine to them. And according to Torah, that shine is associated with the sun and with the star, or with the stars, as he says here. To the point that we talked about the Even Toiv, that gem that according to one opinion, Noach placed in the Tzoya Tasa L'Teva, he placed in the ark, and it did illuminate. And by dark, when it's darker, it illuminates more, and when in the brightness of the sun, it illuminates less. This he brings from the Yerushalmi Psachim and also from the Medrash and so on. The Gemara Sanhedrin Daf Kuf Ches. So that's one thing I wanted to just point out. It also talks about Shoyim and Yashpa, which are translated. How is Shoyim and Yashpa translated? Anyone look that up quickly? In the Choshen, in the breastplate that the Kohen Gadol wore, it talks about a Choshen and Ephod, which are two types of stones. And they are also shiny ones. They're also glowing stones. It is in Pasha Tetzava, right? Let me. So there it also talks about. I just want to see how they translate it into English. Okay. Ruby topaz. Maybe someone can look it up while I teach here, so I don't have to go look it up right now. If you can look up on one of the translations in Tat Tetzava, how they type Shem and Yashba, I believe that also has a certain glow to it. Okay, that's one thing I want to.
There's 12 stones. Which one?
Shoyhem and Yashba.
Yoshfei.
Yoshfei, okay. Yeah. The second thing I wanted to say was this. In Torah Shalom, remember I mentioned the Sichas Simchas Torah Tafrei Samach Zayin when the Rebbe Rashab was talking to the Bochrim. He adds something which helps, which I did say it when I taught it, but it confirmed when I read there. He says, what does it mean when he gives the example of the student and the teacher, that the student has to be an Eira Makabel before he becomes an Eira Mashpia, like the moon? On the bottom of page 1352, he said, but it doesn't radiate until he receives from his mashpia. So the obvious question is, what do you mean? A human being has seichel. You can have seichel without a mashpia. So he says there, but the seichel then will be filled with mistakes and filled with all kinds of stumbling blocks. You need the mashpia to put you in the right direction, as I said, to think in a healthy way. So in that sense, yes, after you receive, you can become a teacher of your own, as he explained, but you'll always have been shaped by the teacher that you had. Even if it's completely internalized and now yours, but it's the teacher that puts you in the right direction. And that's what he means here. So it's true that a human being also has seichel of their own. And I think this is vital when it comes to the moon to recognize the same idea. The fact that the moon has its own light, but it's an Eira Makabel. It always, even its own light, is shaped by the sun. It's never its own light as of a completely independent entity. And we're going to learn about this some more. That's why I'm pointing it out. So it's not like that the sun, I kept saying the sun activates or stimulates the moon, and then the moon shines on its own. He does say it shines on its own, even when the sun is not there. But even that is affected by the sun as it activated the moon. And this is going to be relevant to the difference between the moon light and vision and sight. You find anything?
Yeah, so Shoham there's all kinds of speculation, but primarily it's referring to a stone called beryl, heliodor, which is green, leek green-like color, and blue-green, like the color of sea. Malachite is another word, and yashva is like a ruby.
Ruby. Okay, bottom line is in Torah Shalom, he says that Shoham is bright on its own, and Yashpa needs work to make it bright. I have to look more into that. Anyway, it's not so relevant to the details. I just looked deeper into it. So there's glowing stones, and there's also just the brightness of different stones or gems, like gold, silver, copper. In the Zohar, he actually brings interesting. He brings there that that it was a healing agent. The Zohar says that when they looked at a brass or at a copper mirror, it was a healing element. And one of the commentaries brings it in context with, what was it called when they first discovered, what was it called? The Röntgen? It was a discovery by a German scientist of dealing with healing from cancer, I believe. Even today they use it. What was it called? Röntgen?
A new element?
It was a new element, but it was like a healing agent.
I think you're right. I think you said it right. I have to look at it, but I think you said it right, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it was a wild guess. No, I heard about it. It's not the first time. I forgot what it was called. It's like a scan.
I'll find it, but I think you're right. I'll find it, but
okay.
Go on.
So point being is that I didn't do enough research scientifically how science sees it. But the fact of the matter is, when you see, for example, gold has a shine to it. There's no question about it. Now, it's true. It's a property within the stone itself. But it's not difficult to imagine that it has some relationship with light that either shines through it or makes it glow, or just like a rainbow or like a prism or a crystal. You see, we talked about a diamond and a crystal. They do have a brightness to them. And we know that in the 4 C's of a diamond is cut, carat, clarity, and color. So there is the concept of clarity, how it's positioned in a way that it lets light shine through it, as well as I'm sure the light has some effect on its brilliance and brightness. So I need to look into it a bit more, but it could be that there's a whole topic here that he's referring to when he talks about these bright stones and gems. Because Avonim Tevis and Margolius in general is translated as gems and pearls. Margolius is pearls, and Avonim Tevis is gems. But Avonim Tevis could also be, I say precious stones, which is like another way of saying gems. I'm not sure all the different things. In mineralogy, they have all kinds of different names for it. Anyway, let me take it back to where we are up to. So, firstly, if anybody has any questions, because I did do somewhat of a summary of Ayin Beis Volume 1 and Volume 2, even though I didn't really do it like I usually do it in an orderly fashion, but I did bring a bunch of themes from those areas, from those places that all come together to build up to what we're learning now in the context of light and dark, and ultimately how neshamas, mitzvahs, Torah, all serve as the tools and the agents that really bridge the light and the dark. And that's why he's talking here so much about ner mitzvah, Torah and the different levels of wanted to put it into that context. Okay.
So it's called Röntgenium. So you were like dead on, which is pretty cool. A highly radioactive metal. That's all they say. That's used for
and what is it? It's a healer, right? They use it. What?
Used for X-ray imaging.
X-ray. That's it.
Oh, yeah. That's pretty cool, Rabbi.
Yeah, there's no question that look, even X-ray, ultraviolet, ultra-red, these are all forms of light waves. Some of them are visible, some are less visible, but they all have, we know today, it's not just light and dark. There are all kinds of forces at work, or we could call them even forms of energy. So the fact that some, for example, ultra-red is invisible to the eye doesn't mean it doesn't have light. It's just a different level of light, just like with sound. There's sounds we hear, there's sounds we don't hear. Some sounds, that dogs hear that we don't hear, or other animals.
Röntgen is a quantity of X-ray radiation, so to speak. So that's where it came from.
Yeah, but he said Röntgen, yeah. I think that was the name of the inventor. His name is Röntgen, right? Something like that.
Yeah,
Cor-
yeah, I think
correct.
so.
Correct.
He was German.
Yep, 100%.
I remember something. Okay.
Could be a Yid, who knows?
I didn't meet him, Reminds me, when Ronald Reagan was giving one of his State of the Union addresses, so he quoted Lincoln. And he says, and just for those in the media that are looking for accuracy, I wanted to let you know I didn't hear it directly from him, because he was
Them's
considered
were the
an
good old
president.
days.
Yeah. Okay. So let me just sum up what we learned the last class. And as I said, I laid out the next 100 pages is going to be at length about these different levels of Oyer in the Rebbe Rashab's classic fashion. So after he explained the moon, the sun, the moon, the bright stone, or the gem, or the glowing stone, however we translate it. So then he said, I'm just going to sum up the bottom of page 1353. So here went back and forth. So he said, the TV, like like the sun, because we see it doesn't radiate the night. If it was a meir, meaning a luminary, then it would be like two laser beams, like two flashlights, like a sun. And it doesn't see in the dark. Only the and the only way you could see is when there's daylight, when the sun is shining, or at night when there's a candle shining. There's a reason he doesn't bring the moon, I'm assuming, because the moon is a makabel, and he doesn't want to bring that to confuse matters. So he uses either the sun or the aner. Imkain, how do you gamkein b'chinas makabel? So based on that, it's also makabel because it can't see on its own. It needs to receive light. In other words, there needs to be an illuminating environment or area. When it receives another light outside of itself, then it sees. But then he qualifies. And even though the eye itself is a chemer sfiri, in other words, the eye is not just a inanimate, maybe that's not the right word, a piece of matter. It's not just a black piece of matter. It's a shining, chemer sfiri. It's a luminescent and transparent sfiri ubehiri. There is light. The eye is not like the finger, for example. A finger can't see things. A finger is just a finger. An eye can see because it is conducive to let light shine through it with everything we discussed about that. But kol mokim, nevertheless, it's not an mashpia. Kim b'chinas makabel. Because as we said, it needs another light to allow it to see. And indeed, the power, intensity of the sight, in other words, how strong you'll see things, will be based on the intensity of the sun or the flame. When it's stronger, you can see farther, and you can make out more subtle images. Gufim dakim yeser, and that's that. Then comes the Rebbe Rashab and says, "L'cheri yesh mokum leimer." So maybe based on that, you could say it's not even an air makabel. It's not an air altogether. All it is a neutral, passive reflector, so to speak. Who says it's air makabel? Air makabel says it's an air. And I want to emphasize, and Torah Shalom makes it clear that usually we speak about mashpia and makabel as air and keli. But a keli is not an air. He says here we're talking about in air itself, there's an air mashpia and air makabel. For example, when you talk about a student, you're not talking about an inactive, passive entity. The student has to actively be a air makabel. He has to use his mind to absorb the teachings of his teacher. So the same thing. Maybe you could. So he's saying maybe Riyah is not like that. Maybe it's not even a makabel. Since the Riyah is simply coming, and that's how it sees, so maybe the Riyah is not Mekabel Eir, obviously, it's not the case, but he just wants to make the case that it's Eir Mekabel. Why can't you just say that the eye is like, let's say, like a mirror? It's a mirror. That doesn't make it an Eir Mekabel. A mirror is just a passive entity that has properties that allows things to reflect. So he says, but MS, it's not the case. On the Royin, that the main inyan of Riyah is dependent not just on the sunlight or the light around it, on the strength of the eye. If that was the case, if it was like a mirror, then it's just, I mean, I'm just using an example of a mirror. If it didn't have any role to play, it was not an Eir Makabel, that the eye was not built in a way to allow light to shine through it and see things, then what difference does it make whether you have 20/20 vision or not? So he says, the Ikar Riyah totally betiv kleya ayim mitzad atzmei. So now he's going back that you see the eye needs to be crafted in a healthy way, in a proper way. That when the chaymer ayin chazak b'tekev, when the physical eye is strong, then you could see further and more subtle items, objects. Even when the light of the day is not shining so much, like we discussed. In other words, it's not just how bright the sun is. You could have a very bright day, and if you're weak, if you have weak vision, it's not going to help. When you have strong vision, even if the day is a little dim or at dusk, you can see better. So we see, you cannot just say black and white, it's all about the sunlight or the daylight. You have to say the eye is a participant, more than a participant, a primary role that it plays. Okay. And now he goes the other way around. The gam b'zeh yesh shleima, you could say. So in other words, let me just sum up what he said. So chashachem ra'aynu b'tei b'yesed. So even when the day is weak, it's the sun or the daylight is not so bright. It's enough if he has good vision to be able to see clearly and to see clearly, right? Now he goes the other way. He says gam b'zeh yesh shleima. You could say that now the sun's role is actually not as significant as we first stated. Yes, you must have it, because if it's completely dark, it doesn't matter how good your vision is. In other words, it's important to have a healthy vision. But if it's completely dark outside, it's not going to help that you have 20/20 vision. But you could say then that Eir HaShemesh is only to remove the darkness. It's like removing the cover. So before he was saying that it's the sunlight or the daylight that actually empowers the eye to see. But here you could say it's only to remove Ozroya de Eir HaRiyah. And when he has strong vision, healthy vision, he could see even with little light. So then you would come down, then if you say that, then it's back, so then is the Riyah Mashpia or Makabel? Because now we're establishing that the sun is only removing the block. So is that if someone, for example, if you're looking at something and there's a curtain or there's a cover and someone removes the cover, is the one that's removing the cover being mashpia to you? It's not being mashpia to you. He's just removing the obstacle, so now your eyes can see. Obviously, so it's the strength of your eyesight. So if you say that, then you can go back and say maybe the Eir HaRiyah is not an Eir Makabel because it's not receiving from the sun. The sun is only like someone that's opening the curtain. So he says that's not the case either. So you see, I was going back and forth and making a case that on one hand it's a Eir, but on the other hand it's an Eir Makabel. So what does he say? Ube'emes tzarich lemer shu b'chinas Eir Makabel. It's not just because because going back to the first point, if it was just that, so it's true, okay, you need someone to remove the curtain. But why is the sun, then the eyes don't see in the dark? If they're the power of Eir Mashpia. So you see from this that the sun is not just removing the cover, the sun is actually providing light and here he uses the word the That word is going to play very prominent later in the nimshal, in the moral. So bottom line is, in order to see, you need support. So here's the I would say paradox, but the balance is that on one hand, the eye has a power to see, as we discussed. The healthier the eye, the better it can see. On the other hand, it will not see without the support of light. It needs light outside of itself to allow it to see. So on one hand, is it the eye that's seeing, or is it the light that's shining that's allowing to see? The answer is both. And you need both properly in order to be able to see. And nevertheless, as we established, the eye is not just a passive entity of a reflector, but the eye itself, it's with the light of the eye that you see. But you need the out of yeah. And now I'm going to, from here, I'm going to go, even though I think we learned the next lines, but I'm going to read it now again, more in depth. So this is a summary of what we learned on Friday with a little more elaboration. So now he's going to explain how it's different than the moonlight. And here's where I believe he adds some elements to the moonlight that we didn't fully, at least I didn't fully understand when we first read it. Because the moon seems also to be similar. On one hand, it doesn't have light, it has light of its own. And yet, it doesn't shine until the sun shines within it. That generates and activates that light. So how is that different than the eye? So he's going to say it's different. And I explained on Friday a little the difference. One basic difference is that the levana is fundamentally a koyach helam, he said. It's a koyach hagili and koyach helam. So even though it does have light within it, but its real nature is a concealer, not a revealer. However, it also has an oir in it, and the oir is activated, and it's the sun that's so-called allowing the moon to express itself through its own light. But it's not really a light of its own, whereas the eye. So let's see how he explains it now inside. And the next section, I don't know if we'll get to the end of the paragraph, he's going to explain the difference both between the vision of the eye and its light, the light of the eye, in comparison to the light of the moon and the light of a gem or a glowing stone. So he says now like this: this light of the sun, the eye that we just described, is not like the light of the moon. There we said that the light in the moon comes through the light of the sun that radiates in it. And without that, the moon does not have any light of its own. V'hainu, and the Rebbe Rashab explains. Didn't we say before that the moon has its own light? Yes, there's one interpretation that the moon has no light, it's just reflecting the sunlight. But he said, according to what we said, he said clearly, that it has its own light. So he's qualifying now in the parentheses what he meant. V'hainu gam lefia now, which means even addition gam. Also to what we, according to what we said earlier, that the illuminating moon is its own light. That's why it's called a moed. That was one of the reasons it's called a moed. It's explicitly through the Eir HaShemesh that light shines. In other words, it has its own light, but the light will not shine without the moon, without the sun, without the sun. So we still have to understand, 1 second, didn't we just say the same thing about the eye? The eye also won't shine without the sun. Without light, it can't see. So he's going to explain the difference. So let's be patient and we'll read through it and then we'll come back to see the difference between the two. Mashenkin Eir HaRiyah, by contrast, the Eir HaRiyah, the light of the eye, of the Sav sight, it's Eir Be'etzem. Now remember, there's a difference between Moyer and Oyer. Remember, we learned before, Moyer does not necessarily mean light. You could have a Moyer, that's a luminary, that's a source of Helam, even. Like we said about the Eish Yisedi, The fundamental archetype of fire doesn't have to be fire. It doesn't have to be bright. It's actually called dark. It's dark, but it's the source of light. What makes it is a atzmi. Remember, we said the word atzmi. When we say the word Oir be'etzem means that it is an illuminating element. The moon has the element of a moir as in number one, that it's a source of a particular form of energy. What energy? He called it the energy of concealment. It also has lahoyer, oir, but the moir shebezeh, the moir of it, he said, is the idea that it's an atzmi v'loy oir. He said that clearly. With the sun, with the eyesight, we're going to learn the exact opposite. It's not a moir, at least not on the level we're talking right now, but it has light in it. So if you look at the moon, for example, if you study the moon, even though the moon gives off light, but if you look at the moon fundamentally is a dark body. It's only because there's a sun that you see light. When you look at an eye, the eye is actually a translucent body. The moon is not translucent. The moon doesn't have an iris and a cornea, etc., etc. So what he's saying now is this: and it's the very light of the eye of the vision that he sees. That's why a healthier eye you see better. With the moon, you never say that there's a moon that is 20/20 vision or not 20. The moon doesn't have vision altogether. The moon has a role to play when it comes to light, shining light, it depending on the sun. So even though it has oil of its own in it, but it's always the sun that causes the shining of it. So in other words, there's oil and there's the oil as it shines. So here's but being that it's oil, but it's not an oil atzmi, it's an oil be'etzem. In other words, it's fundamentally from the world of light. The eye. The moon is not from the world of light. The moon is from the world of etzem. The sun is both the world of etzem and the etzem of oil, the root of oil, like we learned before. It's not a helam kol kach, as he said. The eye is similar to the sun that it's light, but it's not similar to the sun. It's not an er atzmi. It's not an er mashpia. That's or if it would be, it would see in the dark. It would be able to give off light, and it doesn't give off light. To radiate the darkness. That's why the eyesight needs another level of light to radiate the darkness. So it itself does not radiate the darkness, and it's the sunlight or the daylight or candlelight, and also helps the eye to be able to see. It needs that support. So that's the distinction between the moon and the moonlight and the vision. So he's going to spell it out very much more at the end of the paragraph on page 1355. But you see the difference here. So now, when we go back to the moon, it's a lot more complex than it first initially sounded. Initially we thought the moon has light, except it needs something else to activate it. The moon is not the world of light. The moon is the world of etzem. God created two types of energy sources. Think of it that way. The energy source of lahoyer, to radiate, and the energy source to conceal. Like the difference between Zah and Malchus. One is Er Mashpia, one is Er Makabel. But there's also an Er element to the moon, but its Er is always dependent on the sun. It never becomes a shining entity completely on its own. Take away the sun, ultimately the moon will not shine. It can shine even when the sun is not shining, like he said, even when the sun is not there, the moon shines, but it's shining because the sun activated it, and it's the sun. Like the teacher and the student. We're not talking about the seichel of the student on his own. The seichel that he learned from his teacher, even when he's on his own, he was taught by the methodology. That never changes. He was put on the right track. His mind is thinking in a healthy way. So when we say, for example, that even the greatest scholar is called Talmid Chacham, this explains why. Why is he called the Talmid Chacham? At some point, he's not a Talmud anymore. He's not a student. Why do we call the greatest people? We always call them Talmid Chacham. You never say Chacham. A chacham actually is like a smartak, chacham from Anashtana, like a chacham, because he always remains in a state of receiving chachma. He's always in a state of recipient. That's the ultimate sign of a wise person. Even when he's mashpia, he's doing that. The sun's role is to be a mashpia, pure mashpia. Zah. And Malchus, as we're going to learn, the moon is the Eira Makabel, but it's an Eir. It has Eir in it. But the moon is an Atzmi, which is even greater than being Eir, because Eir is ultimately light, like we learned earlier, Koyach HaHelam. When it comes to the eye, vision is not an Eir Atzmi. It's Eir, it's in the world of light, but it's not an Atzmi, and that's why it needs the Eir Atzmi and Mashpia of the sun to allow it to see and to help us support its vision. But on the other hand, the eye itself is in the world of light, and the moon remains on its own, not in the world of light, it's in the world of its own world, its own reality. That's essentially what he's saying here. But he's going to explain this further. So let's continue reading. Anybody want to ask anything? I know it's can be a little confusing when you think about it back and forth, because the Torah does say Shnei Me'eres Hagdelim, 2 luminaries, and it says Moira Gadol, Moira Cotton, and he even referred to it. That's a Moir. So what do you mean less lemagam klum? So it's not, but it's not a Moir hamispashet lohoyer. So you have to say it's a Moir that is giving off. He said, like Hashem lohoyer. Yeah, so you have to say it's a lahoyer of a different type of energy. That's how he explains it. I think he's going to go back to it soon as well on the next page. So it's not finished yet. So even if it needs more explanation, the Rebbe Rashab is going to explain it further. I just gave the initial explanation. So let's read on now. He says like this.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
Quick question.
Yeah.
I know you just went over it like 15 seconds ago, but I don't understand this Indian of Or Hariya is an Or Be'etzim, but it's not an Or Atzmi. I get why it's not an Or Atzmi, because that's like the Shemesh, and obviously the eye doesn't like throw off, it's not a Ma'ir. But what does it mean to be an Or Be'etzim? Like the eye doesn't have
That's fundamentally
itself.
In the world of light, in the domain of light. The Levana is not a Or Be'etzim. The Levana is in the world of concealment. It's a different domain. It means it's in the world of light. It's a Or Be'etzim means Atzmi means a source, a luminary light. Etzem means its fundamental domain, its nature is light.
Got it.
In other words, the eye, we're going to learn the stone, for example, the precious stone, it assumes the property and it becomes part of it to be bright, but it's not fundamentally as light as much as the eye is. The eye is more light than the stone, and the moon is even less so. Even though the moon has another element that makes it a Moir and a Atzmi. That's the difference.
Got it. Thank you very much.
I mean, it's strange to say this, but sometimes it's easier to understand some things when you go all the way up to the highest levels. Remember, Atzmus, which is the core divine, is beyond light and beyond dark. We know that. Beyond radiating, beyond illuminating, beyond non-illuminating. Yecholte has the capacity to illuminate, the capacity not to illuminate. We know that because he's built to Metzias Nimtza. He's altogether not defined by anything. So you can't define him by light. You can't define him by no light. So even when he gives off light, you say that doesn't define him. It means he has the power to give off light, right? Now, but then God did create 2 tracks. Atzmus wanted 2 tracks. He wanted a track called Oyer and wanted a track called Helam. Or Shaloi Lahoyer, Tzimtzum. Later, this would be called Havai and Elakim, Oyer and Tzimtzum, or Kav and Rishimu, or Eris and Kalim. That's later on. But in the early stages, there's 2 tracks. So here's the Vart. When you say Etzem Oyer, we learned about Etzem Oyer, or Atzmi. There you're talking about that it's the root of Oyer. And then there are things that are not the root of Oyer, but they're in the world. And if you ask what track do they belong to, they belong in the track of Oyeris, of Kav, of Gilui, of Avaya. Then there are things that belong in the track of Helam, Kalim, Mekabel, Choshech, Tzimtzum. When you go to the highest levels, they both come from one place. And on that highest level, that place is not defined, not by one or by the other. So it's capacity for both. But when they ultimately come into structure, there is things that belong in the domain of light, and Riyah is in that domain. There are things that are in the domain of darkness, and Levana is more in that domain. We're going to learn how all levels have, obviously, they all lead one to the other, and it's ultimately the goal is to bring them all together. But like, for example, when a teacher is teaching a beginner student, ABC, you're just learning Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Aleph. How much Tzimtzum is necessary for that? Tremendous amount, because you're concealing all the ideas that go within the Aleph. The Aleph is the Rosh Tevis acronym for Anoichi, Aleph Hashem Echad, just an Aleph. So initially, concealment is much more dominant than revelation. But as the student grows and expands their mind, they become keli for more gili. So it's really a dance and a balance between Helam and gili, everything in life. Every hashpah, every communication, every relationship, every interaction. A healthy interaction is always going to be a proper balance of how much you're giving and how much you're withholding. Not withholding because of any negative reason, simply because it has to be measured. What's good communication? You talk too much, it's not good. You talk too little, it's not good. So you have to have a perfect balance. Same thing with chesed, which is in the world of gili. You have a perfect flow of chesed, not too much, not too little. Gvura is more in the world of helam. Like we learned, the sweetening of gvura, the whole thing. There too, not too much, not too. So it's all about balance. And as that balance works properly, then you can slowly expand, and there comes more gili and more gili. Now we also know that the helam also has a root that goes all the way to the helam ha'atzmi. So it's important. I just wanted to put it into context, makes it a lot easier to understand what we're learning here. Because here, when, like I said, the mashal, even though it's supposed to be an example which helps us understand it, it makes it more, the mashal is very valuable, is extremely valuable, I would say indispensable, because it makes it tangible. You know, you think of vision, the moon, the sun, the bright stone. You have something to hold on to that you can palpable, that makes it easier to relate to. But the concepts are much easier in a way to understand when you understand them in their root, in the Nelakus. And they're obviously all going to come together. He already connected the two with Helam and Gili before with the moon and the sun. But we're going to learn obviously a lot more of this as we go along. Okay?
Phenomenal summary. Thank you.
Right. Now, I've been thinking about it a lot because I'm thinking, you always want to appreciate something by looking at what would it be like if we didn't have it. You really want to appreciate something, always think the opposite. If you didn't have it, what would life be like? Like if you didn't have music, what would life be like? If we didn't have vision, what would life be like? Now, it's a certain idea that we have different faculties. Every faculty obviously has a very critical role to play, but the idea of vision, the capacity to see, even on a very physical level, that when your eyes are closed or when it's dark and we're living in the dark, so to speak, the person is in the dark, there's lack of clarity. That's ultimately what light is, clarity. Even at a physical level, when you walk into a dark room, and what does the light accomplish when you turn on the light? It doesn't change anything in the room. It just allows you to see. Here's a chair, here's a table, here are steps. Without that, you don't know what's what, and you could even get hurt. With vision and light, what happens is you suddenly can place things. Oh, this is this object. This belongs here. This belongs here. The same thing is in conceptually. A person who's inexperienced and they're doing something, they're going to make a lot of mistakes because they don't have the clarity. A person who's gone through, a seasoned person who's went through trial and error, made mistakes, and learned from them, what happens? He has a clarity. He's able to see something in a different, they can talk to this person and he sees it clearly. Let's say a confusing situation. People don't know what to do about a crisis. a political crisis, a personal crisis. A trained person will say, let's break it down. And they have that type of clarity that wisdom brings. So if you think about it, Riyah is going to really be a tremendous, it's an unbelievable tool, not just enabled to be a seeing eye person instead of, God forbid, someone who's blind, but it actually allows you to find the clarity of discovering the truth of things. You know, people can lie, people can be deceptive, duplicitous. I mean, what do we have here? $billion industry, just the legal industry, just to try to find clarity and truth, discovery. You'll spend months, years in court, bringing witnesses and evidence just to find what? One thing, clarity, the truth. Because we live in such a false world that people lie. And if someone didn't see it, you could always say it never happened. So it's about finding the truth, emes. That's why emes is connected to to riyah, and so on. I mean, that's why we have Eidei Riyah, actual witnesses who saw it with their own eyes. So I just wanted to point out that this is a critical, raise your eyes to heaven and see who created it all. Just to add an understanding where it's really going when you understand this concept here. Okay. Now he's going to say like this. V'haraya lezeh. A proof for this. He just made a distinction between the moonlight and the light of vision, of sight. So he says, Haraya lezeh she'er hariyu b'chinas er be'etzem. Again, er be'etzem, not er atzmi, er be'etzem, that's fundamentally light. U'b'koichei dafke hureya. And it's with the power of vision that you see. You're not seeing with the power of the sun. You're seeing with the power of the eye. But the eye needs the sun to help it, support it, to illuminate and to help allow it to see. Shari b'mokim, the proof for this is, so like that's why he made, now you understand why he made such a big, he went back and forth, because he wanted to establish that Eir Hariyah is the perfect in-between, that it has the power of light, but it doesn't, but the light itself needs support of something outside of it to make it see. But who's seeing? Your eyes are seeing it, not the sun is seeing it. The eyes are not just a mirror, like I said, or other passive entity. So he says like this: Shari b'mokim she'ein tzarich leheres hacheshech. Because when you're talking the area which is an area where you don't need to radiate, it's not dark. You know, it's an area where there's light. He doesn't need help. The eye doesn't need help to see. It's not like the eye will always need a form. Once it's bright, the eye sees automatically. Well, before I go on, let me just explain. In other words, he's adding another point here. If the eye did not have any oir of its own, or like he says, it wasn't oir be'etzem, and it doesn't have the koyach hariyah, then you'd have to say that even when the light is shining, something has to activate, something has to make the eye see. But the eye has all it needs to see. The only thing that's missing is that it should be an illuminated area. And once it's there, it sees automatically without any effort. So you do need the siyua to make it bright, it's not dark, but then it sees and it's going to bring examples of it now. Like during sleep. A person sees a number of things. In other words, when you're sleeping, your eyes are closed. So it means you're not seeing with your eye, but you definitely visualize things. Even though it's in a dream or it's an illusion, meaning it's not real, you're not actually seeing. It's not like when you're awake and you see a person, but you have vision. You're visualizing things. However, it tells you that the power of vision is such the light of vision is such that you could see even when there's no light outside of you. Okay, we need to explain what this means. Because you could say, what does this have to do with the eyes? Your mind is able to visualize things. He's clearly saying mind visualization, like a dream, even if your eyes are completely closed and you're asleep, is associated with Eir Hariyah. Now, I know I can make a case that that's not necessarily the case, but he clearly is saying that. So I definitely want to hear what everybody has to say about it. I mean, I have some theories of how to explain it, and I would read a few more lines just to see the context, but he's clearly saying that. What I would say initially, that it's the same sensation when I see something. You know, sometimes someone wakes up from a dream and says, it's real. I just saw it with my own eyes. Now, we don't mean you saw it with your own eyes, but the power of the what you visualized is as real as if you actually saw it with your own eyes. So it could well be he means that the fact that when you see something, what does it do? It activates the optic nerve that in some way is getting the mind to process that visualization. And when you're dreaming, that same nerve and that same part of the brain is being stimulated. So it could be that's what he means, that it's Eir Hariyah. So it's not Eir Hariyah in the sense where you're actually seeing as we see a physical thing, but it's Eir Hariyah that we see that visualization is not dependent on a light shining. That's what it sounds like he's saying. Maybe there's another way to explain it. I'm just telling you my initial knee-jerk reaction when I read what he's trying to say, to make it sense of it.
Why can't you call it the mind's eye? And that brings up a whole separate topic.
You could, because I'm trying to, because then you could say, so what's the proof to what we're discussing here? I mean, he's trying to establish that the eye sees with its own power and as its own light, and that's and it's not and in contrast, let's say, to the moon that doesn't have its own light. So if you say it's the mind's eye, you could say it's a different type of eye. Is that the same as the physical eye? That's what I'm trying to reconcile here.
Well, you could say the physical eye is also the mind's eye, but
that's what I try to say. Yeah, that the physical eye is the mind's eye, but you happen to be seeing something physical, and here you're seeing something in a dream or in a fantasy. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, that's what I try to explain. That's what I think is the pshat. Okay, fine. Let's continue on and see where he's going, and then we can always go back to understand this. Interesting stuff here, huh? Yeah. Fine. Hasuma. Now we go. Now, now the blind person, Nikra Moire Naim. It's called a Chazal, and in maybe even a Pasuk maybe even says it, that a blind person is called Moire Naim, a person whose eyes are shining. I mentioned yesterday, Friday, Sagi Nor, that there's a lot of light. Moire Naim. Being that you're using the word moir, which is like a source of light, so the fact that Torah uses the word moire naim means that even though he physically cannot see, but there's a Eir HaMeir, there's something that is a light that's there. So he's now introducing another idea. It's a light that radiates to yourself, not to another. In other words, a blind person can visualize things. We know that. We know blind people talk about, they describe images. Even people who never saw anything in their lives. They may not describe the image as we see it, but they can describe something. It's not like they can describe an image. But it's la'atzme lo laheres azulas. It doesn't allow them to see something outside of them. That's what I think he means here. Because if it was that, it would be er mashpia be'etzem, then it would shine also to outside of itself. Not sure what he means by that. Does it mean the blind person can only visualize himself, can't see outside of himself? Because there, in other words, avala'atzmei hu meir mepnei shu er be'etzem. but himself, it could shine because it's oir, because fundamentally there's something there that has a light in it, even though it's not shining outside. Okay. I'm not suggesting I have it figured out. I'm just thinking about it as we learn it.
Maybe he means it partakes of the world of Giluim, and therefore it's visible in a sense, even though it maybe not physically so, but in the philosophical concept, it partakes of the world of that which can be perceived, as opposed to that which can't be perceived, which would be the koach helam, that would be that which can't be perceived, which is dafka intentionally not visible because it hasn't become visible, it hasn't been nizgal, it hasn't been become into the world of Giluim.
I don't know. I'm not going to comment yet. I'm going to continue reading and I'll try to explain it as we read on. Let's read some more. And therefore, the light of vision or sight, the way it is, yeah. He's definitely talking about visualizing something. The mere fact. Remember, I talked before about light. I think the way I would explain it is as follows. We talked about light has two elements to it. One is that something you can see with your eyes. I see you on the screen. I see table, chairs, camera. But there's a thing called clarity, the ability to visualize something in a clear way. So you could have a person whose eyes are open and they're living in the dark. They don't visualize anything. They don't have any clarity. And you have a person whose eyes are closed, and even a blind person who has absolute clarity. So I believe what he's saying here is that when we talk about Eir Ariyah, is the idea of Eir is clarity. Clarity is much more than just seeing something. Seeing is clarity includes in the world of seeing, but seeing doesn't necessarily mean you have clarity. And the same thing the other way. You could have clarity even though you physically may not be able to see something. A person in a dark room doesn't lose their capacity to visualize things. They just can't see the objects in the room. So I think he is talking about that. So in that sense, he's saying, in addition to everything we said before, first on a physical level, the eye cannot see in the dark. It needs light. That's clear. That proves that the eye is not a atzmi. It's not an Eir Mashpia, because if it had light within it, it would be able to shine in a dark room. It doesn't do that. However, it's Eir Be'etzem. It's fundamentally a state of clarity. And that's why so first he said, the first thing he described, he said that when there is light, the eye doesn't need any help to see, because the eye has the power to perceive things, to see things. And then he goes, that even if in a state where it's dark, physically dark, or his eyes are closed, or you're asleep, and the eyes aren't even physically functioning, we still have the power of sight, and we have the power of sight within us. We have the power to see, to imagine, to visualize. Whether it's real or not is irrelevant here, meaning whether it's a real image or not. It could be a dream. You fantasize that an elephant went through a needle, or you fantasize things all kinds of strange dreams that we have, bizarre dreams. But you are visualizing. That means you have the power of riyah. There's an element of light, of clarity. And I say clarity, I don't mean always emes. I mean clarity as in being clearly experiencing something. It's interesting, actually. I'm just thinking about it. In a dream, do we also hear things? You talk about a dream, you usually talk about the images you saw. You don't often talk about, but the truth is people talk in dreams also. They say they heard a voice, they heard a sound. So just as an aside, it's not relevant to this discussion. So I think that's what he's saying here. And that's why he says, Why? Because a sum is lacking the physical power of vision, but he's not lacking the spiritual power or the conceptual power of seeing things. But it's Eira Meir la'atzmei, meaning it's not shining in a way that he can actually see objects, because the blind person is living in a dark state. It's like the sun is not shining for him all the time. He's always in darkness. We, in a dark room, are blinded. But the power of vision, the power of sight, the power to visualize is there. That's right. Since it's not a ir mashpia, so that's why a light isn't shining, so you could actually see. But himself, he's able to visualize things. And that's why the power of vision, as it's in the Chemera, in other words, even if the power of vision that the spirit, the soul has, a faculty called vision, even if it's not b'slapshus b'chemer ayin, for whatever reason, the eye is not experiencing it because the eye is either asleep or the person is blind, God forbid, it radiates. The power of vision is shining. The power of vision did not get diminished just because the lights went out, basically. And then when it manifests in the physical body entity of the eye, there, once it gets into the physical eye, in other words, it's moving what you call the mind's eye, or the conceptual vision, or the visualization, the power of sight, what I would call the power of sight. Once it gets into a physical eye, then the only way you can actually see. In other words, we're not in a dream state, we're not in a blind state. Then the only way, then he needs another light, like the sunlight or any other form of outside light, to radiate El Azulas. That the power of vision does not have. So the power of vision can visualize, can see. If you want to see something physical, with the physical eye, there you need another light. That's why you don't call it ultimately Er Mashpia. So he's adding that that vision has so much power to it. The only thing that's missing, which can't call it Er Mashpia, is that physically it will not shine in a dark situation. So this establishes the proof that he brought, that therefore, that when he sees something else, once that outside light is shining, it still is this power of visualization of the eye that sees. That's the proof. And the proof is because we can visualize even when the light is not shining. So when the light is shining, it tells you it's the eye that's seeing. It's only the outside light that's supporting and allowing you to see physically. And not like the bright or the glowing gem or stone. There, it's an assumed, it acquired light. It wasn't because it has the power like the eye has a power of visualization. A stone is just a stone. You said earlier, it's an inanimate stone, but it assumed the properties of light. Light is ir atzmi. Now let's clarify. Before he said it's not ir atzmi, he said ir be'etzem. So I think what he means here by ir atzmi, not ir mashpia, he means ir be'etzem, that it's fundamentally light. A stone is not fundamental light. It assumed the properties of its mashpia. In atzmi canal. And it's also not like the moon. It's also the eye, the vision is not like the light of the moon. There, it's even less than the bright stone. The bright stone, at least the stone is now bright. The moon is all created. Well, maybe it's similar in that sense. It's light. It's bright. It's the brightness of its light. Not its energy. The brightness of its light is caused by the shemesh, by the sun, by the light of the sun that radiates in it. By contrast, the light of vision, a sight, it's fundamentally a state of gili er, and no darkness can conceal it. The etzem uhuse, in its fundamental nature, like we said, like we see by a blind person or asleep, he sees even in the dark. Not physical sight, but conceptual sight. But in order, the only thing is that for eyesight, in order to see something else, there he needs to receive an that's outside, that's achar from another that's outside of him. And there's a second point, and the primary element of that light, outside light, he needs something that is going to radiate darkness. And then he's capable of seeing be'erariya with the power of his vision. Okay. I think I'm going to stop here. He's going to speak more about it. Yeah. He's now going to explain how the moon has something that the eyesight does not have. And then the eyesight has something the moon doesn't have. Basically comparing all the different types of light here. Okay, I'm going to stop here for today. Any questions? I think now much clearer, at least to me, and I hope I clarified it. We'll read it again. I think it's worthwhile reading twice, 2-3 times. But I think that's the point. Visualization, clarity, sight. It'd be interesting to find out what a person who's never seen, God forbid, someone born blind, how they visualize things. Because they don't have a point of reference. But I've definitely seen descriptions that people were blind. Differently, there are even blind artists that have drawn things because they are able through sound, they hear something, they're able to, I think I saw once a painting by a blind person who never saw an ocean, where he painted the waves based on how he heard the ocean. And his image was quite powerful, quite accurate. So you definitely can see there's a power of visualization that every person has. But I want to look that up a bit more. In a dream, for sure, that's the case. But you could argue, well, it's not really relevant whether he saw or didn't see. The power is, even if he wasn't born blind, the fact is that even after a person loses sight, God forbid, they still can visualize things. That means they didn't really lose the visualization power to envision things. But especially more so even someone who never saw. Because when someone saw like a dream, at the end of the day, what you're visualizing are things you saw at some point, or a distortion of what you saw, but it's based on an actual sight. But the truth is, you probably can imagine things or dream things that no one ever saw. I mean, there are, inventors. You read about who are these Da Vinci and others who envisioned all kinds of things that like completely didn't exist in their time. Machines of the future, stuff like that. So the power of imagination is quite powerful in that sense. Okay. Much more to talk about. Anybody want to ask anything? Okay. So I'm going to stop here, like 3, 6, 9, around 12 lines from the bottom of page 1354.